Good evening, everyone. My name is Georgina Jackson, and I am the director of the Douglas Hyde Gallery of Contemporary Art, located just inside the Nassau Street entrance of Trinity College, Dublin. The Douglas Hyde is a space to see and learn about contemporary art. It was co-founded in a unique partnership between the Arts Council of Ireland and Trinity College, and it opened to the public in 1978 as the first publicly funded space dedicated to contemporary art and the first university gallery in Ireland. Throughout its history, the Douglas Hyde has presented pivotal exhibitions by Irish artists and brought international artists of international significance. We place artists at the center of what we do, and we support artists who push the boundaries of form and convention, and we aim to provoke new ideas. As an institution, we value excellence, inquiry, experimentation, and diversity. Art deepens our understanding of ourselves and gives us new ways of thinking and of seeing the world. And these ideas will very much permeate the conversation that's going to take place this evening. And so to begin, in June 2017, artist Garrett Phelan picked me up near the gallery and brought me to visit the Hyde project in Fingal for the very first time. Inside the work, we talked about his recent projects, the Hyde and Heat FM, and having long been a fan of Garrett's work, I excitedly invited him to do a show at the Douglas Hyde, his first. Garrett is one of Ireland's leading visual artists who continues to break barriers of form and engagement. His distinctive practice manifests through ambitious projects, including independent FM radio broadcasts, sculptural installations, drawing installations, photography, animations, zines, and text ephemera. In recent years, he has completed a series of large-scale ambitious projects that respond to specific issues within our society. In 2016, he created Heat FM, a 28-day anonymous broadcast sound portrait of 18 to 25-year-olds from all backgrounds living in Dublin, a generation whose opinions and beliefs are rarely heard in the public realm. The archive for Heat FM can be found on Bandcamp. And most recently, he realised the Hyde project, as I mentioned, commissioned by Fingal County Council as a permanent, functional public artwork that is continually shaped by its role as a shared space for reflection and creative actions. Phelan's multifaceted project, Free Thought FM, began with the question, how can things be different? This question arose while working on a previous artwork, Heat FM, in which Phelan had many conversations with young Dubliners about the things they were passionate about. He also witnessed up close a system that prevents young people from achieving their aspirations and dreams. And during this process, there were two barriers that kept coming up again and again: access to education and class inequality. What began in the extended conversations of Heat grew over time into the Free Thought FM project, an ambitious and unique artwork involving many people and mobilizing the radio waves as an immediate and urgent public space. People were brought together to talk at length, to tease out problems, to amplify their stories, and to delve into possible solutions to a system that breeds inequality. Taking place in 2019, Free Thought FM was a 30-day live radio broadcast across the city of Dublin and online. Students, artists, academics, community groups, activists, and many others spoke with Phelan and host Jane Brothwood, David Joyce, Calvin Darcy-Kanda, Tamara Harawa, Michelle Kinsella, and Sophie Malherbe about their own experiences of education live from the Douglas Hyde. These conversations formed the core of Free Thought FM, and their vibrancy and concerns were amplified through different media: an installation of Phelan's drawings in vinyl and paint across the walls of the gallery, which remained open to visitors beyond the conclusion of the live radio broadcast, a youth-focused marketing campaign to build awareness of diverse routes to education and the support systems available, on billboards across the city and online through social media. And these images you will have seen at the beginning of the session. A booklet with further details on routes and supports for education, distributed online as a PDF and in print to the gallery and to schools in Dublin. A series of talks in schools with artists, sports people, and politicians, speaking out their own experience. And finally, the book, which we're launching this evening. Rather than simply mapping this project, this book invites key guests, including geographer Jerry Kearns, educator Kathleen Lynch, secondary school project Liam Wegimont, both joining us this evening, and architectural historian Ellen Rowley, to expand upon the issues that most concern them, how class and education has shaped and continues to limit, exclude, and prohibit young people in adults' fulfillment and futures. To begin, Kathleen Lynch explores the role that education plays in our economically stratified society in the reproduction of the class system, where privilege is enabled to perpetuate itself. But crucially, she highlights the potential of education to break this chain. As she remarks in her essay, education has great potential to generate new ways of thinking, knowing, and seeing the world if it is enabled and facilitated to exercise its own power. With over 25 years in secondary education in Ireland, Liam Wegimont rings the alarm bells and demands the abolition of the final secondary school exam, the Leaving Cert. As he states, it is the single biggest obstacle within the Irish education system to the improvement of that system, an impediment to teaching, to learning, to care, to well-being, to community, to student flourishing, and to joy. Jerry Kearns looked at the divisions within Dublin, stating that there's nothing casual about the social geography of Dublin. It's always been inherently political. In tracing how these lines have been drawn, Kearns also looks at how divisions persist, proposing that a very different Dublin is needed. Ellen Rowley steps into the space of the home, thinking through the continuous entanglement of class, housing, and difference, from the monopoly of the Irish suburban house to inner city tenement flats, as she emphasises, social stratification and housing history are long-term bedfellows. Delving into Free Thought FM, Rachel O'Dwyer considers Garrett's long-standing use of radio alongside its history as an idealised public space, as well as reflecting on transmission and sound waves themselves. Exploring the power dynamics in radio, she notes, as with his interest in exclusion and access in education, Phelan is also interested in who gets to speak and have a voice in what is represented and what is omitted. In our conversation, Garrett and I think through the generation of the project and its many facets, what we learned and next steps. And finally, looking back on the project, artist Sarah Pearce acknowledges how we enter into a whole rubric of grammars, systems, and structures that represent the work and affect how it behaves, is received, archive, exhibition, broadcast, publicity, and information. Free Thought FM, she states, is all of this at once. And she reflects on access and equality of knowledge, recognizing that we are all agents of change. We are really delighted to launch this book this evening. It's available on the gallery's website to download in PDF format. And Fernando, our amazing learning and engagement curator, is also going to put a link in the YouTube chat so people have access to it. Before we step into the conversation between Kathleen, Garrett, and Liam, I want to thank a number of people. The book and this event would not be possible without the passion and trust of many, many individuals. Garrett for his creativity and commitment in realizing a groundbreaking artwork, which I realized has now taken kind of 5 years to this point, as well as everyone who contributed to its realization. Jerry Kearns, Kathleen Lynch, Rachel O'Dwyer, Sarah Pearce, Ellen Rowley, and Liam Wegimont for their stirring explorations of class, education, geography, architecture, communication, community, and the possibilities of art. The amazing team on board at the Douglas Hyde who surround me and are with us online, Rachel Donnelly for her intelligence and keen eye, and Noelle Cooper at Unthink for her inventiveness and skill in making this book, who designed it. And it was no easy task in terms of capturing so many different facets, but I think there was kind of an understanding of not only what was at stake, but also how to translate these kind of events and conversations into a book form. And very importantly, the Arts Council for their visionary Making Great Artwork Open Call Award, which has made all of this possible. So this evening, I'm beyond excited to introduce Garrett, Kathleen, and Liam Wegimont to talk about education and access to education in Ireland right now. Kathleen Lynch is a sociologist, Professor Emerita of Equality Studies at University College Dublin, and an adjunct professor in the UCD School of Education. She's worked over many years to promote equality and social justice through research, education, and activism. Her teaching and research are guided by the belief that the purpose of scholarship and research is not just to understand the world, but to change it for the good of all humanity. She was awarded the President of Ireland Prize for her scholarly work on equality by the Irish Research Council in 2019 and appointed a Commissioner of the Irish Equality and Human Rights Commission in 2020. Her book, Care and Capitalism, was launched yesterday in Dublin, and I imagine this important and timely book, which I haven't managed to read yet, but it's on my bedside table, will inform her contributions this evening. Liam Wegimont is Executive Director of GEAN, the Global Education Network Europe, the European network ministries and agencies with a national responsibility for global education in European countries. And since 2005, he has been the principal of Main Temple Comprehensive School, a school on the north side of Dublin with the motto, all different, all equal. Liam has been involved in education for social change, local and global, and informal and non-formal education for over 30 years as a teacher, youth worker, teacher educator, school principal, curriculum developer, evaluator, and speaker. And he co-founded GEAN and more recently co-initiated Angel, the academic network on global education learning. And he's been a visiting lecturer in teacher education and global learning in Nuremberg and at Trinity College Dublin. So to kind of kickstart the conversation after all those introductions, I want to turn to you, Garrett, and to ask you, I suppose this project has taken a substantial amount of time. It has also been a substantial amount of investment, I think, within your life of dedicating not only to the kind of 30-day conversations that happened within the gallery space, but I think all of the things that developed up to that point and then since that point. So I would like to ask you about your own interest in education and particular access to education. That's such a kind of formative part of Free Thought FM, as well as then a focus of this book.
Thank you, Georgina. That was some intro for everybody in the project. Really well encapsulates everything. And thanks, Liam and Kathleen, for being here tonight as well. And I'm eternally grateful for the book being launched, and Georgina, your sticking power, and the team within the gallery's sticking power and commitment to the project as well. It's huge support to me. So my interest in education, why did I come up with Free Thought FM? So my quick route to education was going to the local national school up in Ballygall, Sacred Heart, and then moving directly. I did 4 exams to get into Belvedere, and eventually I got in. My brothers all preceded me in the school, so there was a kind of family history there, and I was very privileged to get into Belvedere. And I knew about that privilege. There was a big reaction in my primary school when I was going to Belvedere. It didn't go down too well, and it was seen to be a snobby school. So I became very conscious of this difference of where I was going, of why I was going. Didn't really understand it. And then when I got in there, Belvedere is a very good school, inner city school, very privileged, fee-paying school. And I knew my father was working very hard to keep me there. And it was blazer but it had a great sense of social justice, the school, very much so. I remember being walked down around the streets of the inner city, in the north side of the inner city, with Father Reedy, who was a great Jesuit there, and him telling us that we would look after these people, and that we were to be very cognizant of that when we were in the school and walking around the school, or going to and in our journey to and from school. That was a good thing. My education side of it, the unfortunate side of it, was that it was a tiered system. I didn't really acknowledge any learning difficulties that I had, so I would have been put right down the end of the B stream, and enjoyed that privilege down there because it was great fun, and I took full advantage of that. But I left the school without a leaving certificate, which obviously would have disappointed my dad greatly, and I was left into the world on my own. But the difference being, and I was aware of it, is that even though I had no leaving cert, I did have the privilege of going to Belvedere College, and I knew that if I said the words Belvedere College, it would have still opened doors for me. And I was very conscious of that. And I was aware of that in the whole education, my understanding of education. I then, using my connections and using my streetwise aspect to how I operated myself, I managed to get into art college without any qualifications, but I got in on portfolio work. And then I left, I didn't like it. And then I ended up at UCD through connections as well, not through academic qualifications. And I did a postgrad out there, didn't complete that for various different reasons. Again, I think it had a lot to do with learning difficulties, undiagnosed dyslexia at the time. And then I moved off and I just dedicated myself to work, and then always had issues writing, even though I'm an intelligent person. To write something was extremely difficult for me. Didn't really understand why. Always thought I felt a bit stupid, and we got that branding by being, I grew up under that idea of thinking that, I wasn't academically proficient or good, and continued thinking that way for a very long time until quite recently. And so through the course of my art making, I became very conscious and aware politically, as a homeowner, as a father as well, and became very conscious and aware of the homeless crisis. About 10, 15 years ago, I worked with a young man called Declan Markey, and we agreed to work. I agreed to work on the art side of it, and he agreed to educate me about homelessness. And we spent a very long time researching the idea of homelessness in Dublin. And I worked with Fiona Barry from Crosscare at that time, who was services manager there, and she mentored me and Declan, and she was a really great help. And eventually I asked her what's needed, and she said advocacy for 18 to 25-year-olds in Dublin City. So therefore we locked it down and we went hell for leather on that idea. And I went for an open call award with the Arts Council and received it under the grounds that it was a 2016 celebratory project, and I would be creating a portrait of anonymous portrait of young people 18 to 25 from all backgrounds. During the course of that, as you've described, I came across rampant prejudice within the city in terms of class difference. I came across huge inaccuracies and prejudice within the city, and I understood for the first time I was heavily confronted by prejudice and the fact that a huge proportion of the community is not catered for or validated or given a free opportunity to access to the same privileges that I had within education that didn't work out for me. But I focused strongly on that, and that project wasn't about me. I set up that project looking at aspirations of young people. I didn't set up the project to look at the negatives. So every time a young person came to me and talked about what they wanted to do in life, they'd usually ended up going, but I can't do that because I don't have the points, or I can't afford to go to college, and this was in all of the areas that we'd look at, the Darndales, the Ballyfermots, the Kipure area, Finglas, all the way and out to the county areas as well. And so when we completed that project, there were the two issues that came up for me. One was the issue of prejudice, and one was the issue of class and the inaccessibility to higher education. So when you approached me to do this project or to work with the Douglas Hyde, I felt that because the Douglas Hyde is situated in the most elitist educational institution in the country, and its history is that, I felt it was really appropriate to raise those two specific issues from my own personal point of view. So rather than Hyde was very much about other people, not about me, Free Thought FM was about me asking these questions and looking to find answers, and thereby bringing in people from all backgrounds like Kathleen and Liam, and people without professional experience in working in education or equality as well. People from the street who just came in, and we invited, and we made the gallery a much more, we really endeavored through the work with Think House Marketing Agency, we really endeavored to focus on really marketing the gallery itself as well into a very open, accessible space, and a space for the people and citizens of Dublin and Ireland. So that's really my interest in where I came from. So it's completely personal experience, and those 2 or 3 issues that were raised for Heat FM that I was confronted by after working with, you know, maybe 150 young people in Dublin City over a very prolonged period of time.
Thanks, Garrett. And Kathleen, I suppose like it's a similar question in this idea of the capacity for change for all humanity is a core part of all of your work. And I think there's also, it's something that comes across in kind of everything that you do. And I know that you also wear many, many different hats. Why is education such a critical part of this change, and why has it been so important to your own work?
Well, I suppose I have a very different background to Garrett. I come from rural Ireland, which I think is very interesting, because everybody talks about rural Ireland as if it's not class stratified. Of course it is. I was even aware of it as a child, you know, because we were farmers, and there were class distinctions between people who were farmers and people who lived in cottages. For whatever reason, I suppose my family were quite politically alert, is what I'd say. So I was very aware of those class distinctions, and that we were better off, not wealthy, but we were better off. So I was really conscious of that, especially when I actually, what was then the InterCert, because I remember we all went to boarding school because my family had done that. But my best friend from the national school left at 15, and we were very close. Like she went to the local school, and she was brilliant at school, really excellent, brilliant at mathematics and everything. Now, as it happened, she had a good job and career, but I remember thinking, why is Teresa leaving? I remember thinking that, because I would have left, actually. I hated school at that level. I might have been good at it, but I didn't like it. I didn't like being confined. I was a free spirit, to put it mildly. I'd come from a very liberated national school at the time, where our teacher didn't do exams, so much so that when we went into secondary school, somebody asked me to write a poem out in English. I duly got the book and started to write it out. I couldn't see why one would memorize something if you had the book. But anyway, that was not the system I discovered. So anyhow, why it matters so much to me is I think it's liberatory. I remember feeling as a child, I do not want to live. I love the country, don't get me wrong. I love rural Ireland, I still do. I feel at home in County Clare. But I knew there was more to the world, and I wanted to know that world. And to me, it was about opening up windows in the world. Windows that were closed if you weren't educated. And it wasn't just about career, but things you didn't know because you weren't allowed to know. Or, you know, the culturally dispossessed are often unable to articulate their dispossession. They have no language because you are not culturally part of the group that has the language, be it visually or intellectually. So I believe that education was liberatory. For me, it was. I remember how wonderful it was, not necessarily in the university, I'd have to say. I wouldn't, yes and no is what I'd say. But a lot of what I learned around the university, around meeting people. So for me, at the political level, to move on beyond my own experience, I'm very much influenced by the idea of ideology and how important it is. And, you know, the media, if you take the 3 major centers of ideology in our society, they remain religion, the media, and education. We have the first 2, we have very little control over. It depends on your beliefs, it depends on the institutions. Religion is very male dominated on the whole. And the media is completely dominated almost by capitalism. So I felt that education should be a space in which people would learn things about the world and come to know their own world, especially social scientifically. Obviously, I'm a social scientist, a sociologist. So because if you knew the world, you were in more control over it. You learned the language, you were empowered to know. So for me, it was really important in establishing equality studies with other colleagues in 1990, 89, 90, that we would educate activists. That's what we set out to do. Now, it was regarded as heresy. They thought we were crazy, but the university, UCD, did allow us to do it. And we started to educate people at night. We taught at night, we taught in the evenings, we ran outreach programs with community groups and community education, because yes, mainstream education I still think is very important, and I know Liam has written about it and all that, but I felt that there were so many other ways you could educate outside the academy, and that wasn't credentialized, but was still very liberatory. So I suppose for me, it was about enabling and ensuring that everybody who wanted to be educated, and I'm not saying, when people say, of course, one of the first jobs I have to tell you, was in the Education Research Centre in Dublin, testing, developing tests. And from that day onwards, I realized there is no such thing as, innate or any other form of given intelligence. It's something you develop. And I am deeply skeptical of all kinds of, these tests of aptitude and everything. And so I just think they're a charade. How can you test a human capability on a pen and paper or online? It's ridiculous. And so I started to have a vision of education which was very wide, and to view every human being as intelligent. And it's fascinating now that you have Paulo Freire, but you also have the French writer Rancière, who's writing about it now as if it was new. I mean, it is known, everybody is. And I always say in the university, people say they're not intelligent. Excuse me, I say they are not interested. I am not interested in the fine points of the atomic bomb or what anything else. I don't care what you would pay me, I wouldn't bother learning it. So I think we have to realize, like, some people know the world through art, through music. Some people, they are different notational systems. And of course, I strongly believe, as you know, in interpersonal intelligences and their importance as well. So I believe in the human capabilities, but I also believe that education is hugely powerful in its liberatory potential for individuals, but also politically. So I don't want to say any more for now, because I want to hear Liam as well. People speak.
Thanks, Kathleen. Good intro to bring Liam in. Liam, I suppose you're also coming from the position of being a practitioner at secondary level in terms of being the principal of Mount Temple, and now in Jean, you work in global education internationally. What draws you to education as a space to work within, and why do you place so much emphasis on it? And I suppose maybe this is also leading towards, I think the next series of questions will also be about change and solution. And I know, Liam, well, everybody's done work within that area.
Well, Georgina, thanks a million. And I have to say that it's a little bit difficult to follow a conversation where some of your heroes have started the conversation. So I'm really honored to be here. And as Kathleen was speaking, I was thinking, I can't possibly follow that, but I'll try. So maybe I'll start with what drew me to education in the first place. And I grew up not too far away from Garrett, but went to Joey's in Fairview. It was a single-sex Catholic boys' school. And, I was reminded as I was preparing for this, Bell Hooks in that marvelous book, Teaching to Transgress. She says, I found in theory a location for healing. And I suppose I found in school a place for flourishing, and not in every subject or in every class, but we had one or two really good teachers in Joey's in Fairview in the 1970s. And one of them was a chap called Finbar Neelan. He was a religion teacher, and he created a space where, looking back, a few very interesting things happened. I mean, first of all, he taught us to question everything, to interrogate received wisdom, not to accept what we were told. That's what he was teaching us. That was his, the thing that he reiterated time and again. Don't believe them. Do not believe them. Question everything. He taught us to think philosophically, but he also taught us to debate and envision. And he taught us, to engage in heated argument about what the perfect political system might be that might lead us towards greater equality, towards greater justice. And I suppose he also inspired me to ask, well, what sort of profession might I engage in that might contribute to creating these sorts of spaces in the world? And so I think at the time, I believed that the most important thing that could be done to change the world would be to create similar spaces for learning. And, after that, I also had the privilege of being taught after some work to pay for college, I went to Mater Dei Institute to learn how to be a religion teacher. And there I met some really brilliant teachers who modeled what it could be like. People like John Devitt, who, he performed every lecture as if it was his last. And he opened up our ideas our minds to the idea that, that education could actually open up people to utmost possibility. I was taught by others in Mater Dei who were firmly in the liberation theology camp or came from feminist theology traditions, but also in education, people who taught us and modeled how to be learning teachers and how to imagine ourselves as constantly learning. But my luckiest moment in Mater Dei, I think, was that Dermot Lane sent me in my final year of college to talk to Anne-Louise Gilligan in St. Pat's. And Anne-Louise took me under her wing. At the time, I was interested in the role of imagination in education for social change. And she not only very kindly suggested to me that there were courses in Boston College that would be worth pursuing in this, but also really everything that Anne-Louise did, her wisdom, her critical thinking, her suggestions that you might delve deeply into one particular theorist rather than flitting around in lots of them. These sort of things have lived with me. But mostly her ability to create educational spaces and to show how people could grow through affirmation. And that, really has stayed with me throughout. So blessed with having models of brilliant educators who, many of whom at the heart of their practice was a belief that education, while it was about opening people's eyes to the way things are, was also and fundamentally about learning together how to change things towards greater justice, greater human rights, greater care for the earth, greater sustainability. I'm going to conclude now, but simply by saying that after 7 years teaching, I thought I'd had enough of formal education because I began to believe that that greater justice could be pursued by moving towards non-formal education and youth work. And I still believe that some things can be achieved in non-formal education that are unavailable in schools and in formal education. But nonetheless, life is long, and sometimes we learn that things aren't always black and white. And so I've learned as a school principal, but also in working with policymakers who are trying to change education systems, that to put social justice at the heart of education transforms the way, not only the way we think and build curricula and look at teacher and educator education, but also at how things actually work. And I think that for me is crucial. I think I've spoken enough, Georgina. Thanks for the question.
Great. It's very interesting. Thank you, Liam. And I think that relationship between kind of practice and ideology, I know, Kathleen, you've mentioned the importance of ideology, but it's also being able to bring those two things together that can occur at certain moments. I think, Garrett, you had a question for for Kathleen.
Yeah, for Liam or Kathleen?
For Kathleen.
Kathleen. So with you, it's a kind of it's a ridiculous question, Kathleen, on one level, but basically, after your years of experience and knowledge and growth and your contribution around, equality in studies and general equality, if there was one change that you'd recommend to the powers that be to lead towards the transformation of the education system, so that it would create a greater equality and fairness within that system, what would that one thing be? It's a ridiculous question, I know, but what would be, based on everything that you said there, if there was one radical change that you'd make, what would that be?
Well, actually, I've thought a lot about that recently as I came to the end of writing Caring Capitalism in particular, and I started writing on it more extensively since. And that is that we need to rethink the ontology, which is the concept of the human person that underpins education. I think we are driven still by Cartesian rationalism, the idea that everybody is simply rational in the cognitive sense rather than the emotional sense. And there is a complete ignoring, really, of the way in which our feelings for the world, our morality, arises from our relationality. And what I mean by that is, I think there's, in terms of social change, there's a naive intellectualism in education and in politics and in academia. You learn by doing, you make the road by walking. And if we want to bring about social change, for example, I would say we need to alter the modes of assessment. First of all, what we allow to be recognized as knowledge in education. That's a huge problem because many forms of knowledge and knowing are not recognized because we're driven by this idea of abstract reasoning as the pinnacle of understanding, which is only one form of understanding. So I'm saying we need to redefine, you know, Howard Gardner's theories of multiple intelligences. There are multiple more intelligences, including moral intelligence, interpersonal, intrapersonal. So we need to recognize those. So that's one thing. But we also need to recognize that the human being, the person, is relational, and that everything we do in this life has implications for somebody else. We live interdependently with other human beings and with the earth and with other species. So when a child goes to school, what is the first thing they learn? They are stratified. You spoke about it yourself, Garrett. But they're in the better reading group or they're not in the better reading group. They learn to compete and they learn to win. And what I'm so concerned about is that neoliberal capitalism dominates education completely. Human capital is the purpose of education, mainly market-oriented. Yes, there are some subjects that are outside that frame, but most of it is about that. But if we want to create a different world, which I've always been interested in and hoping to do and work towards, then we have to educate people to practice and to think differently. That is a mind-blowing concept. I do not believe that people in the Hobbesian view of nature, that people are bad, and I don't believe in the Cartesian view that they're simply, people who are rational simply in a cognitive intellectual fashion. Human beings are far too complex to be put in those boxes. And if we want to bring about change, then we have to remove the concept of individual competitiveness in its extreme form, which is what we have. And to be honest, I think it's true of all. I'm an extern and have been in every institution in this state, North and South, the North, and in several European universities and the UK. It's the same. But we do not have a concept of the human being in their relationality and in their morality. That people are moral persons, they're relational persons, they know and understand other people, and they want to do good. But we don't educate them to do that. We educate them to win. You must win. You must be the first in the class. You can't be the last. You must get the best seat in the restaurant. You must have the best car, the best house. You must always win. And so I would say, if we want children and young people and ourselves to be different, then we have to reward them for cooperation. We have to reward and affirm their attentiveness to others, their relationality, their understanding of those who are less privileged themselves or equally privileged to themselves. We need to think differently about what we do in education, both the subject matter, but also how we evaluate. Because if we evaluate only on the basis of individual competition, and if you look at anything, we have hardly any joint evaluations in school. Nothing, hardly anything. And when you try to do it, as I did many times in the university, there's huge resistance because the students think I have to get. When we started equality studies in 1990, for 10 years, we didn't have a graded master's degree. But it was an honours degree, and we managed to get that through the university. As they say, that's a long story, but we did. But after 10 years, the market came in on top of us, and people had to have first class, 2 1s, 2 2s, because they'd say, oh, well, how do we know? But nothing in life is achieved collaboratively. accept collaboratively, Even the book I wrote, my name is on it, but it is built on the shoulders of everybody. So that is what I think we need to change. We need to change what we evaluate, how we evaluate, and how we affirm the capabilities, the multiple capabilities, and we need to work collectively. So I don't know if that answers you, Garrett, but I have thought about it a lot, because I feel when I wrote my first book, The Hidden Curriculum, which is a long time ago, 1989, it was published, and it was about that. There were 102 secondary schools involved in it at the time. And it showed you, like, children, they go into school full of idealism. Young people are full of idealism. And what do? We destroy it. We teach them, look after yourself. You are the first and the last. And I said the metaphor of the iPhone and the iPad, which are ubiquitous, actually reflect how capitalism, and it's morality, because we forget that neoliberal capitalism has morality. And if we don't contest it, I've argued that we need to make care and social justice, like Liam has written about social justice and education, the dominant morality of our society. So that's enough now. I hope it answers your question. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen.
That was great. Thank you, Kathleen. Liam, I'm sorry to put you on the spot now after Kathleen. But this question, I think that idea of like this one significant thing or two significant things could fundamentally change the system in which we exist. I mean, I think it's so interesting, Kathleen, what you're talking about. I think, I can't remember now, is it Harvard or Yale, when this happiness course that has become this kind of pervasive course that all of the undergraduates that are involved in it and like love it, because it's kind of about how to live a life, how to care, how to be connected. That success that we're kind of told as being all important is actually kind of one part, and perhaps a really insignificant part of life. But it's interesting to think about these different stages that one goes through, which I think Garrett also brought in terms of like, and Liam, the primary school, the secondary education, these particular moments. And I know, Liam, obviously you're working within the kind of secondary education space, as well as the policy and development of those spaces. So if you could change one, I'll give you two things maybe, because I think Garrett was very tough with Kathleen. What would they be?
Okay, well, I'm tempted to resist that question for a moment, if I might, because Kathleen's focus on the need for a new ontology has reminded me of a piece that I wrote, an earlier piece for the free thought process, which was about arguing in a similar vein that we need new ontology, but also a new epistemology. We need to be asking questions about what we understand in regard to how people think and know, and also in regard to our understandings of sociology of social change and curriculum and that. So I'd be really interested in continuing that philosophical thread and ask Kathleen a few questions. But perhaps before I do that, I should answer your question, Georgina, and say that, I think it's no secret that for me, in terms of the Irish education system, the Leaving Cert, that's what needs to change. And while I'm really delighted at the announcement that reforms are on the way, I think that, if you get a chance to have a look at that chapter in the book, I say it perhaps too often, that the Leaving Cert as it now exists is evil, and it has to go. And so I would say that if that was to be transformed properly, and I hope it will be, then assessment is put first in the current Leaving Cert, and learning is second. That has to change. It has to be the other way around. It's a question of tail wagging dog. And secondly, the needs of third level to segregate and to have a selection process, that's what determines the Leaving Cert, and that has to change as well, because it's, to overuse this metaphor, it's not a question of tail wagging dog, it's the neighbor's bigger dog's tail wagging our little dog. the second level education system should be about care and about second level students learning. So how's that going to be at the start of this, at the heart of the system? Well, maybe two things. First of all, if student voice was a lot more clearly at the table, including student representative organizations, the ISSU, the National Youth Council, if they're at the core of determining what curriculum is, we might have some hope. And also, if social justice was at the core, there might be the chance that we'd move to a different model. Hope I kind of answered that question. But more in the book.
More in the book, exactly.
Which is a thing of beauty.
It is. Garrett, did you have a question for Liam?
For Liam, I did, yeah, and it was kind of a good segue from what Kathleen was saying into, you know, just the pressures of you know, secondary school for students, and this kind of drive for the individual and for the success, and this success focus and getting the absolute, you know, top points and trying to get your course and you know, and dreams being shattered through that leaving cert, you know, process. And I was going to ask you, Liam, you know, the recent reforms that have just been announced by the Minister of Education, do they create greater equality and fairness across the board?
Okay, first of all, Gareth, I would say that I welcome the announcement of reforms, but I say this because I'm not currently the principal of Mount Temple. I'm on secondment to Jean, so I'm not speaking on behalf of Mount Temple or on behalf of Jean, but just personally, I couldn't wait for reform. It's 42 years too late as far as I'm concerned. And frankly, when asked, is this the right thing? I would have to honestly say, as I have been saying for the last 15 years or so, it's like that joke about the young lad that is stopped by an American tourist close to the Five Lamps and asked, how can I get to O'Connell Street? And the young lad says, well, I wouldn't start from here. And similarly with leaving cert reform, I wouldn't start from here because the system that we have is, as I said before, it's evil. It militates against learning throughout the second level system. It destroys care. Well-being programs that are introduced earlier in the system are then decimated in terms of individual care by the stress that the leaving cert causes. So I think that you know, the leaving cert, as far as I'm concerned, it has to go. And if the announced reforms, which I hope they will lead to a root and branch reform that puts learning ahead of assessment, that would be marvelous. But I'm hopeful, but I'm not naively optimistic, because there are also plenty of vested interests that want to maintain things in regard to the leaving cert. And I suspect that we'll hear plenty of voices keep wanting to keep things the way they are before we get some real reform. Hope that answered your question, Garrett.
It does. It makes me want to ask you about 5 others, though.
We're just, maybe you want to hold that thought, and I'm just going to say, if anyone who's watching online wants to ask a question, or Kathleen, I've just noticed that your hand is also raised.
No, mine is just a quick comment that I think I take Liam's point, because we want this to be a bit of a dialogue about the leaving cert. But I also think we have to face up to what this subject of your book is about, which is class inequality. And the reason the leaving cert is used as a means of selecting by class, if you replace it, you have to think of how will class work out through the next system. I think there is absolutely no doubt there will be resisted, but there will be another mechanism. You have the baccalaureate, you have A-levels, you have the gymnasium in Germany. I mean, I have worked with the European Commission I'm no fool as regards to how education is a means to selection and stratification. So I just think, there is a danger, I think, at the moment. And there's a lot of talk about home-based assessment. Home-based assessment, anything that involves assessing children at school for anything that involves work you do at home is automatically class biased. Completely so. I give the example of music in the Leaving Cert. 50% of it goes to outdoor performance. We know perfectly well that the numbers have massively increased, especially in wealthier areas where people can afford to get their children to do music privately. And they perform very well, and most of them do not do music in college. They get, very high points because they can pay privately for music competencies and basically the performance fee. So I'm only saying that as a health warning. I think we have to think the issue of class and class politics, which is so fundamental to in education, is right, Liam, it's been used for that purpose. But let's not delude ourselves that class won't manifest itself in another form. That's all I'd say. And then some will say, oh, they should have continuous assessment. I have worked extensively with continuous assessment. And again, there are always high stakes. It may not come in one exam, but it comes over time. So I suppose because I think it is problematic because it is so tied to social class. It is what I do think we need, Liam or Garrett, is what I'm saying, is that we need alternative routes into ways of life. There can't be just one exam that exists for everything. There must be alternative routes, and they must be accessible. And like you say in the book, they must be visible. It's also like a minefield trying to get information in Ireland about anything. It's impossible. Why don't we have a Q&A on the Department of Education's website where it's an ongoing dialogue about all these things? You put in your question and somebody answers it. What is the implications of taking foundation level maths? Well, it's enormous. But I mean, I've done studies and I've seen people take ordinary level courses. They don't know that they can't get certain grades with those courses for higher education. Nobody tells them. So I think there's so much change. But I'm only mentioning it because
can I interrupt you, Kathleen? Sorry to interrupt you for a second. I asked you the ridiculous question of making one change, and then, how naive am I being by thinking that one change can happen quickly, or how naive am I being, and was I in the project that I spent 5 years on, thinking that educational parity could exist quickly? Is it a completely naive? There's probably a lot of bureaucrats and public servants who are nodding their heads going, you're completely naive moron to be even kind of expecting some change to happen quickly. But yet it seems to me that every young person in the country wants the change quickly. And the fact that the minister came out and pushed 2 exams into a year that I always referred to as the DOS year. 5th year was always the year where you could kind of chill out and enjoy the summer and, relax. And now they've put the 2 heaviest subjects into 5th year. And that, to me, I was thinking about it for the last couple of days, thinking, but then only the privileged people who can afford the grind for Irish to send their kids between 4th and 5th year to Irish college are now going to, so there's an extra expenditure on that for families that other families simply can't afford. So for me, I want to look at the reform in a positive way, and I want to embrace change in a positive way, but yet those reforms feel like they've burdened everybody financially, and they've added gargantuan amounts of stress on young people now in the 5th year, which was originally the DOS year. So it doesn't seem like this one thing that you're talking about, which I completely love and love the concept of, and but I just see, why am I feeling that I'm being naive thinking about that it's going to take such a long time for change to happen within our system?
I think Liam might answer it better than I will, but I'm not saying it. Like Liam said, there are a lot of vested interests. But don't forget, the most powerful vested interests are middle-class families who are positioning their children to do well in society. Sorry, they are the most powerful. We saw it when they tried to introduce legislation that schools could not select their children on the basis of their family background or where their parents had been to the school and all. They resisted it, you know. So I think, I'm not saying that loads of things should change. There's so many, I wouldn't know where to start, and I can't say it in 2 minutes. But I suppose what I'm saying, it's not naive, but you have to start the conversation and you have to begin to look at some of the things that could be changed. Like, I did agree with Liam completely that young people need to be listened to. Children in primary school are forced to sit down all day at 4 and 5 years of age. It is not natural. 5-year-olds most of the day. It's crazy, but we don't ask children. They want. We don't have a mechanism for listening. And I am somewhat skeptical of the student councils and all, because I don't know how nationally representative they are. And the voices I've heard articulate are overwhelmingly middle class and upper middle class. So there are many people, and I have to say it, and I know people who actually think that schools are very egalitarian institutions by comparison with a lot of others. I would say that. They are far more egalitarian than a lot of than our healthcare. They go out of their way. The best teachers really fight for their children. I can mention a community schools I know on DESH schools are fantastic. And, I'm not saying that people aren't entitled to those ambitions and social mobility for their children as well. So I think you have to be very careful when you say everything is wrong. And you have to think of, well, who do we hear? And who will we hear in a society where money gives you a voice? I am very skeptical of some of our democratic institutions at the moment, because I do not think they are wholly and fully represented. Sorry, I'll hand you over to Liam, because I know Liam has more ideas maybe than I have on this.
No, I certainly wouldn't like to come across as suggesting that we need to change everything, because I also know very clearly that, schools are, as I started off, schools are spaces of freedom, and that good teachers everywhere always create, in spite of constraints, always create spaces of freedom for students. I do think that student voice has been neglected throughout the Irish education system, and historically, the partners of education were teachers, school management, parents, local community. Children and students were the last to be mentioned and to be valued. So I think we need to head in that direction. However, I'd say two things. One is that, yes, reform is not only difficult, but complex. And one of the great things that the NCCA did in their reflection on what needs to happen was to look at reform and at senior cycle systems in 6 other jurisdictions. And I think we have to learn from other jurisdictions, and particularly at those who do equality well, if we're going to learn how to change. But we haven't had a culture of educational reform or curriculum reform in Ireland. In Finland, that I know the best after Ireland, they do it every 10 years in every level of society. Sorry, every level of the education system. We don't, and we haven't. So it's going to take a while, but we need to think of curriculum reform and leaving cert reform, not as a one-off thing, but as something that will happen in an ongoing way. And Gary, do you mind if I return to your question of were you being naive? Because if I don't want to bore you with too much, but Patrick Kavanagh once talked about 2 types of naivety. The naivety of the young lad going out into the world, believing that everyone was wonderful and that he was capable of anything. And the naivety of the chap who was coming back home, having been out in the world, having seen that perhaps not everything was rosy and perfect, but choosing naivety nonetheless. And Kavanagh said that second order naivety was the ultimate form of sophistication. Now, why am I mentioning that? Because I actually think that the role that you've played in as an artist looking a little bit from outside critically at an education system, that's crucial for, for a healthy democracy, that critical reflection by our artists in regard to the systems and structures of our society. I think that's really important. So sorry to go on for long, but I hope that naivety is maintained.
I add something there, Georgina. I think it's very Garrett as well, what you're following on, Liam, from what you said, is that in the partners, so-called partners in education, civil society is not represented. And that, I think, is a serious fault in the legislation. There are many, the working class community groups, the Deaf Society, women's groups, we have a massive body, groups representing children with intellectual and physical and other disabilities. We have a huge infrastructure of civil society, but they are totally outside the frame of new thinking. So along with the children, and I do believe you can talk and find out a lot from very young children and the teenagers, we also need to engage civil society in the reform, because they are because the artists and intellectuals that come from outside the mainstream are often very dynamic. I was thinking of the spectacle of defiance that was initiated in Rialto and that community, in canal communities, during the austerity period. It was so full of imagination and art and resistance. And it came from grassroots working class movements and women and men in those areas. It did not come from the leaders of education, I'm sorry to say. And I think that those who are, change comes from the periphery. And the periphery in education now are many of those who are on the outside, Garrett. You're absolutely right, because they can see the absurdity of it. And there are many people outside, but I'm a great believer and constantly changing civil society, not having these, like you talked about, Liam, in other countries, bringing in new voices, not being afraid of what they will have to say, because they will challenge what we think and what we know.
Garrett, I don't know if there's anything else you want to.
No, that's
it might be a good. I kind of feel like this conversation, I mean, I think this is, in some ways, this whole project, the development of the book, all of this has been part of a kind of bigger, larger conversation that obviously will continue. I don't think we're happy with the status quo, and I think that there's a lot of work to be done, but it's been so fantastic. Liam, Kathleen, Garrett, thank you so much for your generosity in speaking this evening. It's been such a rich conversation, and one I think that a lot will be taken away from, and lots of food for thought. And then also just to mention again that the book is free and is downloadable in PDF format, and you can also kind of scroll through it very beautifully on the internet as well, with special thanks to Noelle and Think, who has been an absolute star. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks.